21:47 hours, October 12, 1988. The final orders of the evening moved through the kitchen with mechanical predictability. Each tray assembled under fluorescent light. Each receipt printed with uniform precision. At Register 3, a minor disruption occurred. So small it registered only as a hesitation. A paper slip, already processed, was lifted again, folded once more than required, and briefly placed beneath a tray liner before being removed and returned to the counter. The sequence lasted less than 5 seconds. No customer reacted. No manager intervened. Yet within the closed system of a fast food operation built on repetition, the act stood apart. The restaurant itself occupied a transitional space between commercial and administrative zones, positioned along a secondary road that connected a rail depot to a cluster of government offices. Traffic fluctuated in predictable waves. Midday congestion driven by clerical workers, late afternoon surges tied to transport schedules, and prolonged lull that settled in after nightfall. By the final hour of operation, the environment narrowed to a controlled routine: inventory reconciliation, surface cleaning, and a gradual shutdown of equipment. Within this system, the staff functioned with practiced efficiency. Movements were standardized, interactions minimal, and deviations quickly corrected. Registers were balanced at fixed intervals. Orders followed established assembly lines. Even informal behaviors, breaks, conversations, pacing, conformed to an unspoken structure shaped by repetition. It was an environment where consistency replaced oversight, and familiarity reduced the need for scrutiny. The waiter assigned to Register 3 had been part of the system long enough to blend into its rhythm. His presence did not attract attention. It stabilized it. He arrived before his scheduled shift, often by 15 to 20 minutes, using the time to prepare his station without prompting. His transactions were typically accurate, his pace measured, his demeanor neutral. Supervisors noted reliability rather than initiative, consistency rather than adaptability. In a setting that valued predictability, these traits positioned him as dependable but unremarkable. Over time, however, small variations began to surface, subtle enough to evade immediate notice, but consistent enough to form a pattern when observed across multiple shifts. His handling of receipts occasionally diverged from standard procedure. Instead of discarding them immediately after processing, he sometimes retained them briefly, folding or aligning them before disposal. These actions did not interfere with service flow, nor did they produce measurable discrepancies in register totals. They existed within the margins of acceptable behavior, yet they repeated with increasing frequency. His schedule also reflected minor irregularities. While officially assigned fixed hours, he demonstrated flexibility that exceeded operational requirements. He accepted shift extensions without negotiation and rarely requested time off, despite indications of external obligations. Breaks were taken at variable intervals, often shorter than permitted, and occasionally postponed without clear reason. These adjustments did not disrupt staffing levels, but suggested an underlying need to maintain presence during specific time windows. Financial indicators, though not formally tracked within the workplace, became visible through informal channels. Contributions to shared expenses among staff were delayed or reduced. Small loans were requested and repaid inconsistently. Personal phone calls, limited by policy to designated areas, increased in frequency during off-peak hours. The content of these calls remained private, but their timing and urgency implied external pressure. Indirect references to his personal circumstances emerged through routine interactions. He supported 2 dependents, both of school age, and managed ongoing medical expenses related to a spouse with a chronic condition. These details were not emphasized in conversation, but appear in fragments: requests for schedule adjustments, mentions of clinic visits, and observable fatigue during extended shifts. The financial strain was not explicitly stated, yet it shaped his behavior in ways that aligned with sustained pressure. Amid these routines, a recurring customer began to establish a presence within the restaurant's operational timeline. His visits did not follow a fixed schedule, but adhered to a discernible pattern when analyzed over several weeks. He arrived during low-traffic periods, typically between peak service windows, and selected seating positions that provided clear visibility of both the entrance and the service counter. His orders were minimal, often limited to a single item, and his duration of stay exceeded what such an order would justify. His behavior remained within the boundaries of normal customer activity. He did not engage staff in extended conversation, nor did he exhibit overt signs of surveillance. However, his consistency in positioning and timing introduced a variable into the otherwise stable environment. He appeared neither hurried nor idle, maintaining a posture of passive observation that blended into background while retaining strategic awareness of movement within the space. The intersection between the waiter's minor irregularities and the customer's recurring presence did not immediately produce suspicion. Each element, considered independently, could be attributed to routine variation. Staff turnover, fluctuating workloads, and personal circumstances all contributed to deviations within the system. It was only through sustained exposure that these elements began to align in a manner that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The layout of the restaurant played a role in facilitating unnoticed interactions. Service counters created partial barriers between staff and customers, while seating arrangements introduced zones of reduced visibility. Certain within the dining area allowed for brief exchanges, placement of items, adjustment of trays, or repositioning of materials, without drawing attention. These were not concealed but functioned as natural gaps within the flow of movement. During several observed shifts, the waiter's handling of orders associated with the recurring customer displayed slight variations. Trays were assembled with the same components, yet their arrangement differed subtly. Receipts were placed in non-standard positions or folded before being presented. These adjustments did not alter the transaction outcome, but introduced additional steps into a process typically optimized for efficiency. Closing procedures further revealed patterns. As the restaurant transitioned into its final operational phase, staff responsibilities narrowed to specific tasks: cleaning, inventory checks, and cash reconciliation. The waiter occasionally extended his presence beyond the completion of his assigned duties, remaining in the dining area under the pretext of final inspections. During these periods, the recurring customer, when present, maintained his position until shortly before closing, departing without interaction. External movements added another layer of observation. The waiter was seen exiting the restaurant briefly during low-traffic intervals, citing inventory-related reasons. These exits were short and did not coincide with scheduled breaks. Their timing, however, often aligned with the presence or recent departure of the recurring customer. The proximity of the restaurant to public infrastructure, bus stops, utility access points, and pedestrian pathways provided multiple avenues for brief, unmonitored activity. Despite these overlapping patterns, no single event constituted a clear breach of protocol. Transactions remained balanced, customer service metrics unchanged, and staff performance evaluations unaffected. The system continued to function without disruption, absorbing minor deviations as part of its operational tolerance. What distinguished the situation was not the scale of the irregularities, but their persistence. Each deviation, though minor, adhered to a timing structure that repeated with measurable consistency. The waiter's adjustments in routine, the customer's calculated presence, and the environmental that facilitated brief, indirect exchanges formed a network of actions that existed just below the threshold of scrutiny. By the end of the observed period, the environment retained its outward normalcy. Orders were processed, equipment was shut down, and staff departed according to schedule. The fluorescent lights dimmed incrementally as sections of the restaurant closed, leaving only essential areas illuminated. Surfaces were cleared, registers secured, and inventory logged without discrepancy. Yet within this routine conclusion, the earlier moment at 21:47 hours acquired renewed significance. The brief misplacement of a receipt, its unnecessary folding, its temporary concealment beneath a tray liner, no longer appeared as an isolated lapse. It aligned with a sequence of actions that, when viewed collectively, suggested intentional modification of a standardized process. The system, designed to minimize variation, had begun to reveal a pattern of controlled deviation. The source of that deviation remained undefined, its purpose unconfirmed, but its presence was now established, not through disruption, but through the quiet accumulation of detail. The restaurant closed as scheduled. The staff dispersed into the surrounding streets, each returning to routines beyond the scope of observation. The waiter departed without incident, carrying no visible indication of irregular activity. The recurring customer had already left, his absence as consistent as his presence had been. What remained was not evidence in the conventional sense, but a framework, an arrangement of timing, movement, and behavior that resisted simple explanation. Within that framework, a single, nearly imperceptible mistake had occurred. It had not altered the outcome of any transaction, nor had it triggered immediate consequence, but it had introduced a variable into a system defined by repetition. And once introduced, that variable did not disappear. The irregularities that had once blended into the operational background began, over time, to resist dismissal. They did not escalate in scale, nor did they interrupt the visible flow of service, but they persisted with a consistency that suggested structure rather than chance. Within an environment governed by repetition, it was not the magnitude of deviation that attracted attention, but its recurrence within defined intervals. The first sustained observation emerged not from management oversight, but from proximity. A shift supervisor, responsible for balancing registers and coordinating late-hour operations, encountered the same sequence of minor inconsistencies across multiple evenings. Transaction logs processed by Register 3 displayed no financial discrepancies, yet their timestamps occasionally diverged from kitchen output records by narrow but measurable margins. These gaps, often no more than 40 to 60 seconds, occurred too frequently to be attributed to routine delay. The supervisor's role required a familiarity with patterns. End-of-shift reconciliation depended on identifying anomalies quickly and resolving them before closure. In this context, the repeated timing discrepancies stood out, not as errors requiring correction, but as deviations without clear cause. The waiter's transactions remained accurate in value, but their sequence suggested interruptions that were neither documented nor explained by workflow demands. Attention gradually extended beyond the register. The supervisor began noting the waiter's movements during periods when these discrepancies occurred. On several occasions, the waiter adjusted his position within the service area immediately after completing specific transactions. These adjustments were brief and did not disrupt service, yet they coincided with moments when a recurring customer was present within the dining area. The customer's pattern, previously indistinct, became more defined under observation. His visits, when charted across multiple weeks, revealed intervals that aligned with the waiter's extended shifts. He did not appear during peak hours, nor did he frequent the establishment on consecutive days. Instead, his presence followed a staggered schedule, often returning after gaps of 2 to 3 days, always during periods of reduced activity. His behavior within the restaurant remained controlled and consistent. He selected seating positions that minimized direct visibility from the counter while maintaining an unobstructed view of staff movement. He rarely altered these positions, even when alternative seating was available. His orders were placed without hesitation, paid in exact amounts, and consumed slowly, extending his presence without drawing attention. The supervisor began informal documentation, initially as a means of resolving operational inconsistencies. A small notebook, typically used for inventory notes, became a record of timestamps, positions, and movements. Entries were concise and factual: arrival times, order numbers, seating locations, and the duration of each visit. No assumptions were recorded, only observable data. Over several shifts, the entries formed a pattern. The timing discrepancies at Register 3 occurred predominantly when the recurring customer was present. The waiter's minor deviations in procedure, folding receipts, adjusting tray placement, or pausing briefly before completing a transaction, aligned with these moments. Each action, considered independently, remained within acceptable bounds. Together, they suggested coordination. The physical layout of the restaurant was reevaluated in light of these observations. Within the dining area that had previously been incidental now acquired significance. Certain tables provided partial concealment from the counter, particularly when occupied by a single individual. The positioning of waste bins and condiment stations created brief interruptions in line of sight. These features, designed for customer convenience, also introduced opportunities for unnoticed interaction. The supervisor adjusted their own routine to increase observational coverage. Shift schedules were modified to overlap consistently with the waiter's hours. Responsibilities were redistributed to allow for extended presence near Register 3 without disrupting workflow. These adjustments were implemented gradually, avoiding any noticeable change in behavior that might alter the environment being observed. As the observation period extended, additional details emerged. The waiter's brief exits from the restaurant, previously attributed to operational tasks, were timed with increasing precision. These exits occurred shortly after the recurring customer concluded his visit or, in some instances, immediately before his arrival. The duration of these absences remained brief, rarely exceeding 2 minutes, but their timing suggested a connection. External, near the restaurant, were noted a public waste receptacle position along the side entrance, a utility access panel adjacent to the parking area, and a bus stop shelter within short walking distance. Each provided locations where brief, unsupervised activity could occur. The waiter's exits, when mapped against these, revealed overlapping proximity, though no direct interaction was observed. The supervisor's documentation expanded to include these external movements. Times of exit and return were recorded alongside internal observations, creating a continuous timeline of activity. The resulting sequence did not present explicit evidence of misconduct, but introduced a framework in which the waiter's actions could be analyzed as part of a coordinated pattern rather than isolated behavior. The central conflict began to take shape not as a confirmed act, but as a contradiction within the system. The restaurant operations depended on predictability. Yet within that predictability, a set of actions had emerged that followed a separate, concealed rhythm. The waiter functioned within both systems simultaneously, maintaining visible compliance while adhering to an underlying sequence of movements and timing that served an unknown purpose. The recurring customer's role within this framework remained undefined but increasingly significant. His presence appeared to trigger or coincide with specific actions, yet he maintained sufficient distance to avoid direct association. He did not engage in observable exchanges, nor did he exhibit behavior that would justify intervention. His consistency lay not in frequency, but in precision. The supervisor's observations reached a point where passive documentation no longer satisfied the need for clarity. The accumulation of detail suggested intentionality, yet without direct evidence. The pattern remained circumstantial. To move beyond observation, a more focused approach became necessary, one that would test the relationship between the waiter's actions and the variables that appeared to influence them. A plan began to form, grounded in the same principles that had guided the observation process: consistency, minimal disruption, and reliance on verifiable data. The objective was not confrontation, but confirmation. By controlling certain elements within the environment, timing, positioning, and proximity, the supervisor aimed to determine whether the observed patterns would persist under altered conditions. Initial adjustments were subtle. The supervisor positioned themselves closer to Register 3 during anticipated periods of activity, maintaining routine interactions while increasing visibility. The waiter's behavior did not change immediately, suggesting either unawareness or confidence in the established pattern. Transactions continued with the same minor deviations, and the recurring customer maintained his routine. Further adjustments involved timing. The supervisor altered the sequence of tasks assigned to the waiter, introducing slight delays or advancing certain responsibilities to observe potential shifts in behavior. These changes were implemented within acceptable operational limits, ensuring that service quality remained unaffected. The waiter adapted to these adjustments without resistance, but the underlying pattern of discrepancies persisted. The recurring customer's visits continued to align with these periods, though his arrival times displayed minor variations. These variations, when analyzed, appeared to compensate for the adjustments in the waiter's schedule, maintaining the overlap between their presence within the restaurant. This adaptability suggested a level of awareness that extended beyond coincidence. The supervisor's documentation now reflected a dual-layered system: the visible operations of the restaurant and the concealed pattern of coordinated timing. The intersection of these layers defined the central conflict. On one level, the waiter remained a compliant employee fulfilling his duties. On another, his actions suggested participation in a process that operated independently of the restaurant's purpose. Despite the growing clarity of the pattern, the absence of direct evidence maintained a barrier to escalation. The observations, while consistent, did not confirm the nature of the activity. The possibility of benign explanation remained, though increasingly unlikely. To resolve this uncertainty, a decisive step would be required, one that carried inherent risk. The plan evolved toward a controlled point of interception. Rather than relying solely on observation, the supervisor identified an opportunity, to access an item within the sequence of actions that could provide tangible evidence. This opportunity would occur within a narrow window between transaction completion and disposal of materials, a moment when the waiter's routine allowed for brief separation from processed items. The risk associated with such an action was acknowledged. Any deviation from routine behavior could alter the pattern, potentially ending the sequence before its purpose was understood. The success of the plan depended on precision, timing, discretion, and the ability to replicate normal activity without introducing detectable change. As the observation period approached this stage, the environment remained outwardly unchanged. Customers entered and exited according to patterns. Orders were processed, meals served, and equipment maintained with the same efficiency that had defined the system from the outset. The waiter continued his routine, his actions consistent with both the visible and concealed patterns that had been documented. The recurring customer's next visit was anticipated within a narrow time frame based on previous intervals. The supervisor prepared to implement the plan during this window, aligning their position and responsibilities to maximize proximity without disrupting workflow. Every element of the environment was considered in terms of its potential impact on the outcome. The section concludes at the threshold of action. The pattern has been established, the variables identified, and the plan prepared. What remains is the execution, a single, controlled intervention that will determine whether the observed sequence represents coincidence or coordination. The system, until now defined by observation, is about to be tested. The anticipated window presented itself without deviation. The recurring customer entered during a low-traffic interval consistent with prior observations, selected his usual seating position, and placed a minimal order at Register 3. The waiter processed the transaction with the same measured efficiency that had defined his routine, yet the familiar sequence of minor irregularities followed: a slight pause before finalizing the receipt, a controlled adjustment of the tray's contents, and a brief repositioning of paper materials that extended beyond standard procedure. The supervisor maintained proximity under the pretext of routine oversight, aligning their position within the narrow operational margin that allowed visibility without intrusion. The environment remained stable, no disruption in service, no deviation in staff behavior beyond what had already been documented. The moment identified for intervention approached with the same quiet predictability that had characterized every preceding step. The transaction concluded. The tray was assembled and passed across the counter. The receipt, rather than being discarded immediately, was folded once and placed beneath the edge of the tray liner, partially obscured but not concealed. The waiter shifted his attention to the next order, creating a brief interval in which the processed materials were no longer under direct supervision. The supervisor acted within that interval. The movement was minimal and consistent with routine handling, lifting the tray under the pretense of repositioning it on the counter, adjusting its alignment, and in that motion, separating the folded receipt from its placement. The action was completed in less than 2 seconds. The tray was returned to its original position, the sequence uninterrupted. The receipt, once removed, revealed a second layer. The paper's thickness differed slightly from standard print stock, and its fold pattern suggested intentional structuring. Within the fold, a narrow insert had been embedded, unmarked on its exterior, but distinct in texture. The supervisor did not unfold immediately. Instead, the item was secured within the pocket of a standard order pad, maintaining the appearance of routine documentation. The remainder of the shift proceeded without visible change. The recurring customer remained seated for his usual duration, then exited without interaction. The waiter continued processing orders, his behavior consistent with prior observations. No immediate indication suggested that the intervention had been detected. The supervisor deferred examination of the retrieved material until the end of the shift, adhering to a controlled environment where observation could occur without risk of exposure. Within a secured office space used for administrative tasks, the insert was unfolded with deliberate care. The contents did not resemble conventional correspondence. The paper bore no letterhead, no identifying marks, and no complete sentences. Instead, it contained a series of structured elements, numbers, abbreviated notations, and segmented sequences arranged in a format that implied coded information rather than narrative content. The significance of the material was not immediately interpretable, but its form aligned with the possibility of structured data transfer. The absence of context, combined with a deliberate concealment within a routine transaction, elevated the document beyond incidental anomaly. It represented a controlled exchange embedded within an operational environment not designed to detect it. The supervisor recognized the limitations of independent interpretation. The material, while indicative of irregular activity, required analysis beyond the scope of workplace oversight. The decision to escalate was made within procedural boundaries, prioritizing documentation and preservation over speculation. The insert was resecured. Its handling minimized to maintain integrity. Initial contact with local authorities was framed within observable facts. Repeated transactional discrepancies, the presence of an unidentified individual with consistent behavioral patterns, and the recovery of a concealed document embedded within standard operational materials. The report avoided inference, focusing instead on verifiable details and documented timelines. The response followed a measured progression. Local authorities conducted a preliminary review, cross-referencing the reported activity with existing records. The absence of immediate criminal indicators delayed escalation, but the structured nature of the recovered material prompted further consideration. The case was forwarded to a regional office with jurisdiction over matters involving potential information transfer beyond commercial or personal scope. Federal involvement was introduced without disruption to the existing environment. Agents operated under the premise of observation rather than intervention, preserving the conditions that had allowed the pattern to emerge. The restaurant remained operational, its staff unaware of the broader implications of the activity that had taken place within its routine. The recovered document was subjected to controlled analysis. Its format suggested compartmentalization, data segmented in a manner that required external reference for interpretation. The lack of encryption in the conventional sense indicated reliance on pre-established coding systems or contextual keys. The material simplicity, rather than diminishing its significance, aligned with known methods of low-visibility information transfer designed to evade detection through complexity. Parallel to document analysis, background examination of the waiter was initiated. Employment records confirmed his tenure and consistent performance metrics. Financial review, conducted through accessible channels, indicated sustained pressure, irregular payment patterns, outstanding obligations, and limited access to external support. These factors align with profiles commonly associated with susceptibility to external influence. Surveillance was introduced incrementally. External observation points were established to monitor entry and exit patterns without altering the internal environment. The recurring customer became a focal point of this effort. His movements were tracked beyond the immediate vicinity of the restaurant, revealing a pattern of indirect routes and variable destinations that resisted straightforward classification. Within the restaurant, internal observation remained passive. The waiter continued his routine, unaware of the shift in scrutiny. Additional transactions were monitored, and in several instances, similar concealed inserts were identified through indirect means. Each instance reinforced the initial finding, establishing a consistent method of exchange embedded within standard operational procedures. The central conflict, once defined by uncertainty, now acquired structure. The waiter's role transitioned from subject of observation to participant in a verified process of information transfer. The recurring customer, while still unidentified, was positioned as an intermediary or handler operating within control parameters. The environment that had once masked these interactions now served as a framework for their analysis. Interviews with staff were conducted under the guise of routine administrative review. Questions focused on operational procedures, employee routines, and general observations. The objective was to gather contextual information without introducing suspicion. Responses confirmed the waiter's reliability and routine behavior, reinforcing the contrast between his visible role and concealed activity. The chain of custody for the recovered materials was formalized. Each document was cataloged, its recovery time and location recorded with precision. Handling protocols ensured that the integrity of the evidence remained intact, allowing for subsequent analysis and potential legal proceedings. The process emphasized continuity, ensuring that each element of the investigation could be traced without ambiguity. As evidence accumulated, the scope of the operation expanded. The possibility of isolated activity diminished, replaced by the likelihood of a structured exchange network operating at a low level of visibility. The simplicity of the method, embedding information within routine transactions, suggested an approach designed to exploit environments where repetition reduced scrutiny. The decision to transition from observation to controlled intervention was approached with caution. Premature action risked disrupting the network before its extent could be determined. Delayed action, however, increased the potential for continued information transfer. The balance between these factors defined the next of the investigation. A strategic plan began to take shape, integrating the waiter's established routine with the broader objective of identifying and intercepting additional participants. The recovered documents provided a foundation, but their full significance remained dependent on contextual linkage, timing, location, and the individuals involved in their transfer. The section concludes with the investigation poised of escalation. The initial act of interception has transformed suspicion into evidence, and evidence into structured inquiry. The environment remains unchanged on the surface. Yet beneath that surface, a coordinated effort is now in motion. The system that once concealed the activity is now being used to expose it. The transition from verification to active surveillance altered the structure of the investigation without altering its visibility. From the exterior, the restaurant continued to operate within its established routine. Orders processed, shifts rotated, and closing procedures executed with consistent precision. Internally, however, the environment had been reclassified from a place of employment into a monitored within a broader counterintelligence framework. Federal oversight introduced a layered system of observation designed to preserve normalcy while extracting detail. External teams were positioned along transit routes leading to and from the restaurant, documenting movement patterns not only of the waiter and the recurring customer, but also of peripheral individuals whose presence intersected with identified time frames. Vehicles were logged, pedestrian noted, and durations measured with minute-level accuracy. The objective was not immediate identification, but the construction of a timeline dense enough to reveal structure. Within this expanded framework, the waiter's routine acquired new dimensions. His movements, once interpreted as minor deviations, were now plotted against geographic markers beyond the restaurant. Each exit, however brief, was tracked in relation to nearby urban fixtures. A public waste container positioned near the side entrance, a maintenance access panel along the adjacent wall, and a narrow pedestrian corridor leading toward a bus less than 50 meters away. These locations, previously incidental, emerged as of interest through repetition. Observation over multiple days revealed that the waiter's brief absences aligned with a secondary sequence distinct from his internal workflow. The timing of these exits corresponded not only with the presence of the recurring customer, but also with subtle environmental cues. Gaps in foot traffic, reduced visibility from passing vehicles, and moments when internal staffing patterns minimize oversight of external doors. These variables, when combined, suggested intentional selection rather than coincidence. Surveillance teams extended their focus to these. The waste container was monitored for signs of disturbance inconsistent with routine use. The maintenance panel, though locked, was examined for external markings or evidence of repeated contact. The bus became a point of passive observation, not for its function, but for its proximity to the other identified locations. No overt exchanges were captured initially, yet the consistency of the waiter's proximity to these reinforced their relevance. The recurring customer remained central yet elusive. His movements outside the restaurant displayed an irregularity that resisted predictive modeling. He did not follow a fixed route, nor did he utilize consistent modes of transport. At times he departed on foot, merging into pedestrian traffic without pause. On other occasions, he entered vehicles that could not be reliably linked across multiple sightings. This variability suggested operational awareness, whether deliberate or procedural. Despite this ambiguity, patterns emerged in his timing. His visits continued to align with specific intervals, never consecutive days, rarely exceeding a predictable frequency. His duration of stay remained stable, and his internal behavior did not deviate from established norms. He neither accelerated nor delayed his routine in response to environmental changes, maintaining a consistency that functioned as both camouflage and control. The accumulation of surveillance data allowed analysts to construct a composite timeline integrating internal transactions, external movements, and environmental conditions. Within this timeline, the waiter's role became increasingly defined. He functioned as a transfer, bridging two operational layers: the visible environment of the restaurant and the concealed network operating through its periphery. His actions, though limited in scope, were precise in timing and location. To validate this interpretation, agents introduced controlled observation at one of the identified. Without altering the waiter's routine, they monitored the waste container during a scheduled window corresponding to previous activity. The objective was to detect any interaction that might confirm its use as a dead drop site or intermediate. During the observation period, the waiter exited the restaurant under the same pretext previously documented. His movement toward the container was direct but unhurried. He paused briefly within its vicinity, his posture consistent with routine disposal behavior. However, the duration of his presence exceeded what would be required for that action. Upon returning to the restaurant, his movements resumed without visible change. A subsequent inspection of the container, conducted under controlled conditions, revealed a concealed item positioned beneath the upper layer of refuse. The item, similar in form to previously recovered inserts, was contained within a protective fold designed to resist casual detection. Its placement indicated deliberate concealment rather than accidental inclusion. This discovery provided confirmation of a dead drop mechanism integrated into the waiter's routine. The restaurant functioned as a point of initial transfer, while the external served as an intermediate storage location, accessible without direct contact between participants. The simplicity of the method minimized risk while maintaining operational continuity. With this confirmation, the investigation advanced toward intervention. The priorities shifted from observation to controlled disruption, with the objective of isolating the waiter's role and identifying any additional participants. The timing of this transition was critical. Premature action risked severing the connection to the recurring customer, while delay increased the volume of transfer material. The arrest was executed during a controlled interval when the waiter's movement pattern indicated an imminent external interaction. Agents positioned within the vicinity intercepted him as he exited the restaurant, ensuring minimal visibility to staff and customers. The action was swift and contained, preserving the integrity of the environment while securing the subject. Evidence collected at the point of arrest included a folded insert consistent with previous findings, as well as personal items subject to standard examination protocols. The waiter was transported to a secure location for questioning, and the chain of custody for all materials was documented with procedural precision. Interrogation proceeded within an analytical framework. The waiter's responses were evaluated against established evidence, focusing on sequence, timing, and method rather than intent. His account revealed a recruitment process grounded in vulnerability. Financial pressure, compounded by ongoing medical expenses within his household, had created of leverage. Initial contact had been indirect, framed as an opportunity for supplemental income requiring minimal effort. The tasks assigned to him were incremental. At first, they involved simple actions: handling envelopes, adjusting placement of items, and maintaining specific timings. The absence of explicit context allowed these actions to be perceived as low risk. Compensation was provided consistently, reinforcing compliance without necessitating understanding. Over time, the tasks evolved into a structured routine. The waiter became responsible for ensuring that specific materials moved through the restaurant environment without detection. His role did not require knowledge of the content or its destination. It required only adherence to timing and placement. This compartmentalization limited his awareness while maintaining operational efficiency. The recurring customer, identified by the waiter as the source of initial contact, remained undefined in terms of identity. The waiter's interactions with him were minimal and controlled, restricted to the exchange of materials within the framework already observed. No direct communication extended beyond these interactions, and no personal information was shared. Despite the clarity of the waiter's role, the broader network remained obscured. The handler's identity could not be confirmed through the waiter's account, nor could the ultimate destination of the transfer materials be established. The operation, by design, minimized exposure at each, ensuring that the compromise of one participant did not reveal the entirety of the system. Following the interrogation, attention returned to the external environment. Surveillance continued at the identified, with the objective of detecting any response to the disruption. The absence of the waiter introduced a variable into the system, and any subsequent activity, could provide insight into the handler's awareness and adaptability. Days passed without immediate indication of response. The recurring customer did not appear within the anticipated intervals. The dead drop location remained undisturbed, its previous use suspended without visible replacement. This absence, while inconclusive, suggested that the disruption had been detected or anticipated. The section concludes with the operation in a state of controlled uncertainty. The waiter's role has been defined, his participation confirmed, and his methods exposed. Yet the central figure, the handler, remains beyond reach, his presence inferred but unverified. The investigation has illuminated the structure of the exchange without revealing its origin. What remains is a question of whether the network will reconstitute itself or remain silent, leaving behind only the evidence already secured. The absence that followed the waiter's removal did not resemble closure. It resembled recalibration. Within monitored zones surrounding the restaurant, the expected patterns did not resume on schedule. The recurring customer did not reappear within the established temporal window, and the previously active external remained undisturbed. Surveillance teams maintained positions, extending observation periods beyond standard protocols. Yet the system under study appeared to have shifted into a dormant state rather than a disrupted one. This silence was not treated as resolution. Instead, it was interpreted as a potential adaptation. In counterintelligence operations, inactivity could function as concealment, and absence could serve as a deliberate signal of compartmentalization. The network, if it existed beyond the documented exchanges, had demonstrated the capacity to absorb the loss of a single node without exposing structural integrity. A controlled operation was initiated to test this possibility. The objective was not immediate capture, but controlled reactivation. Agents reconstructed the restaurant environment with minimal visible alteration, restoring operational conditions to those recorded prior to the intervention. Staffing patterns were stabilized, external observation was reduced to non-intrusive levels, and the identified were remonitored under passive conditions. The intent was to determine whether the system would attempt re-engagement in the absence of its compromised asset. The waiter, now in federal custody, remained a contained variable within this equation. His legal processing proceeded independently of operational surveillance. Documentation confirmed his role as a low-level intermediary, with limited awareness of the broader structure. His statements, consistent with earlier findings, reinforced the conclusion that recruitment had been opportunistic rather than ideological. Financial vulnerability, not conviction, had defined his entry into the system. Sentencing considerations reflected this distinction. While his actions had facilitated unauthorized information transfer, his understanding of its significance had remained incomplete. The consequences imposed upon him were administrative as well as punitive, intended to reflect participation without attributing strategic intent. His personal circumstances, once exploited as leverage, now functioned as context within the legal record. Despite his removal, the operational network did not immediately reconstitute itself. The recurring customer's absence persisted beyond expected variability. Surveillance logs confirmed no verified sightings matching his previous behavioral profile. Transit routes, previously associated with his movement, yielded no consistent activity. The pattern that had once been stable now lacked its central anchor. Yet within this absence, subtle irregularities began to emerge. At one of the previously identified external, a minor disturbance was recorded, insufficient to confirm reactivation, but consistent with prior handling signatures. The disturbance did not include any recoverable material, but the positioning of displaced elements suggested intentional contact. This development prompted renewed analysis. The controlled environment at the restaurant was maintained with increased sensitivity. Surveillance teams expanded temporal coverage, extending observation into previously unmonitored intervals. The objective was to detect any attempt at re-establishing contact with the compromised system. Despite these measures, no direct interaction occurred. The structure remained inert, yet not abandoned. Internal review of the case highlighted a persistent uncertainty, the identity and scope of the handler. While the waiter's role had been fully documented, the individual responsible for recruitment and coordination remained only partially defined. Surveillance data suggested a figure operating with deliberate distance, maintaining separation not only physically but structurally, ensuring that each asset interacted only with adjacent layers of the system. This design complicated the possibility of full disruption. Even with the removal of a functional node, the absence of direct exposure to controlling element preserved the integrity of the broader structure. The system had been observed through its edges, but not through its core. In response, a secondary operation was proposed. Rather than rely on passive observation, analysts considered the reconstruction of previous conditions to induce voluntary re-engagement. This approach required replicating environmental variables associated with prior exchanges, while introducing controlled inconsistencies designed to provoke response. The strategy carried inherent uncertainty, as it depended on the behavioral predictability of an unknown actor. Implementation of this plan began with the gradual restoration of the restaurant's original operational cadence. Staffing schedules were adjusted to mirror documented patterns from the period preceding intervention. External observation points were reactivated in limited capacity. The previously identified were monitored with heightened precision, focusing not on activity alone, but on the absence of deviation. For an extended period, the system remained unresponsive. Days passed without measurable change. The restaurant functioned within its normal parameters, yet the absence of the recurring customer persisted. The dead drop locations remained inactive. No secondary contacts were observed. The silence suggested either termination of the network or deliberate withdrawal. Then, at a time consistent with prior behavioral intervals but not identical to them, a minor anomaly appeared in the surveillance record. A transient presence was detected near one of the external, brief enough to evade visual confirmation, but sufficient to register environmental disturbance. The pattern did not match the waiter's previous activity, nor did it align precisely with the recurring customer's documented behavior. It suggested either a replacement node or an adaptation of method. No material was recovered from the site during immediate inspection. However, the disturbance indicated that the structural framework had not dissolved. It had adjusted. The absence of the waiter had not terminated the system. It had altered its expression. This realization redefined the scope of the investigation. The original assumption that removal of the asset would collapse the network was no longer valid. Instead, the structure demonstrated redundancy, capable of sustaining function through substitution or rerouting. The handler, whether directly involved in the observed disturbance or operating through an intermediary, remained active. Efforts to reestablish direct contact pathways were reconsidered. Analysts concluded that continued passive observation would yield diminishing returns unless paired with controlled exposure of the system to new variables. However, such exposure carried the risk of further concealment, potentially pushing remaining elements deeper into operational invisibility. Within the strategic uncertainty, the case entered a classified holding state. Surveillance continued at reduced intensity, sufficient to detect reactivation, but not to provoke it. Documentation was consolidated, and operational resources were partially withdrawn to prevent overexposure of monitored sites. The waiter's file was closed under restricted classification, his role preserved within archival records as a confirmed intermediary rather than a strategic actor. The recurring customer's identity remained unresolved, categorized as an unverified operational figure associated with multiple incomplete sightings and behavioral correlations. The final assessment did not declare success or failure. Instead, it recorded a partial disruption of a low-level information transfer mechanism with incomplete attribution of control authority. The system had been observed, partially mapped, and temporarily interrupted, but not dismantled. In the closing analysis, attention returned to the initial moment. A minor deviation at Register 3, unnoticed in real time, later revealed as the entry point to a structured sequence of concealed exchanges. That moment, once insignificant, now functioned as the origin point of a pattern that had extended beyond immediate comprehension. The final status of the network remained undefined. Whether it had retreated, adapted, or continued under altered conditions could not be confirmed. What remained certain was only this: the environment that had once revealed its structure had returned to silence, and within that silence, the possibility of continued operation persisted without visible form. The case was archived, but not resolved.